everyone. Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hello. Hello. Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you. So today we are going to have a look at research which is being done for a new publication which I'm putting together entitled Tailoring for Women 1800 to 1930. It's being published by Bloomsbury and we're hoping for it to be published in early 2027. So it seems like a million years away, but it will go very, very quickly, I'm sure. So this publication is going to be the culmination of essentially a 5-year research project. It's actually slightly longer than 5 years now, by another network that I'm part of that many of you are very familiar with. And that network is called Tailoring for Women 1750 to 1930. And we have been generously funded by the European research body called Accorso. So our research over the last few years has been looking at the diffusion, design, manufacture, technology, products, material culture, retailing, trade, commerce, and the related sartorial etiquette of tailored clothes for women specifically during the period of 1750 to 1930. And as a research group, we've undertaken, I think it's 4 conferences now. Several of us have published our research over the years. And I've also organised a couple of at-homes under the auspices of Tailoring for Women. So I think many of you are familiar with us. The presentations today represent some of the research that is going to workers, including myself, and they represent some of the research in 4 chapters of the book. Overall, there'll be 10 chapters by 12 contributors. So this is just a small part of what's going into it. I thought up the idea for this at home because as you're putting together an edited collection, research continues alongside the writing. And so for the editor, which is myself, and for all the other contributors as well, it's often useful to hear how those chapters and that research is evolving and taking shape, and how the process of research and writing is going. And so sessions like this, where essentially we get together and we discuss our research, are a really good opportunity for you to hear about our research in this area. And also for us to, as contributors, to share our research amongst ourselves and to remind each other as we're working on it, what kind of areas we're covering and what directions we're going in. So that kind of sums up today's session. Hopefully it gives you a bit of context for the papers that you'll hear today. Anna, the lovely Anna, is going to be question master for today. Thank you, Anna. So if you just put any questions that you've got in the chat as we're going, you don't need to unmute yourself. Please try and stay muted throughout the whole session. Just put your question in the chat. Anna will field those to our speakers between our papers. So she'll get round to as many as she possibly can. So that's probably enough of my waffling, if we can keep on time. So what I'm going to do is hand over to our very first presenter. So our first presenter is Dr. Marie Mcloughlin. She's an honorary research fellow at the University of Brighton. She's taught there for many years, specialising in 20th century fashion. Her chapter for the book will be entitled The Origins of the British Tailor-Made, Creed and Redfern, English Tailors in Paris. And today she's presenting research on royal influences and English tailors. So over to you, Marie.
Here we go. Can you all see that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Good, 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 good. I'm afraid I'm going to just try and make you all a bit smaller. Without luck. That's successful, isn't it? Here we go. So this is a very broad taste of some research I'm doing on how and why British tailoring for women became so popular in Paris, the home of couture. Sorry, I'm failing to change slides. Am I doing something wrong?
That's okay. Have another go.
Marie, you might be in your Zoom app versus being on the PowerPoint app. So if you can sort of click on the PowerPoint itself and see if that switches you into that, and then you can move it forward.
It's asking me if I trust myself. I'm really not really sure, but I've said yes. Oh yeah, yes, right.
Yay, well done.
Sorry, I'm getting a lot of messages across the screen, so I can't quite see it. Right, so this is what I'm talking about basically. On the left is a Creed suit, a walking suit, or might be a boating suit for Empress Eugenie, and on the right, a boating dress for Alexandra, the Princess of Wales by Redfern. Oh, they were two of the most important and influential women of the century, and these two tailors were lucky enough to have them as clients right at the start of their right at the very start of their careers. They were both cited as the first people to create tailored walking suits for women rather than riding clothes and so on. Redfern is frequently described as the first person. My money's on Creed. He was a men's tailor who made riding dress for women, and Redfern was styled himself from the outset as a ladies' tailor. He began with riding dress. Creed began with riding dress. Redfern began with sailing dress. So in short, they both entered the fray with upper-class sporting pursuits. Trying to pinpoint when women's tailoring moved from being sportswear to day wear would make an important contribution to the history of women's tailoring, I feel. So that's what I'm trying to do. So whilst the name of Redfern's not important, that of Creed, and other than the perfume house, another story, is not. So in addition to the primary sources I've been using, these are the secondary sources I've found useful. On Creed, this autobiography by Charles Creed, written in 1961, is notoriously unreliable, but very entertaining if you read it. However, I suspect there may be a grain of truth in many of his anecdotes. He claims that Henry Creed Sr. made the first walking dress for a woman when he made a suit for the Duchess of Alba at the request of the Duke to match his colourful checked suit. As a check, this could not have been riding dress. As she died in 1860, this is likely to be the 1850s. North, whose costume articles on Redfern are exemplary, it's a summary of her MA, dismisses this claim of Creed, saying he was not born until 1863. I actually have 1861. In fact, here she's confusing the birth of Henry Creed's son, another Henry, with the Creed who makes clothes for Empress Eugenie. By 1863, he was already a very successful tailor in London and Paris. I've examined a Creed jacket of this period, which I'll talk about later. The Duchess of Alba, this possibly the first client for a walking dress, was a sister of Empress Eugenie, and as Creed claimed to make the riding clothes for all the heads of state in Europe, including Eugenie's husband Napoleon III, it's quite likely that its brother-in-law, the Duke of Alba, was a client. Redfern. Looking at Redfern, Susan North's costume articles, there are two, are essential reading for any study of Redfern. Now, if I tell you he had 5 sons who changed their name from Redfern to Russell, and 2 key managers, Mims in the London store and Pointer in the Paris store, who changed their names to Redfern, you'll begin to get some idea of how complex this Redfern story is. In the 20th century, to make it more complicated, Pointer bought out the Paris operation, but continued under the Redfern name. And Redfern UK continued for a while, but was bought out by Busveen, a name we'll meet again later on. And North's work indicates the huge reach of the Redfern brand, which eventually had 11 branches on 3 continents. She argues very convincingly that he is as important to world fashion as Worth, and I agree. But Creed's important too, and he's just disappeared from the histories. Sorry, just have a sip. Kate Straston's work on the Princess of Wales is invaluable in demonstrating how a provincial draper in a small town on the Isle of Wight was able to make the leap into the world of international high fashion, initially through the patronage of the Princess of Wales. And it's fascinating looking at this shopping habits, if you were, of the upper class. Carisbrooke Castle Museum, this is a museum right in the middle of the Isle of Wight. Kate Tyler, the curator at the museum, has been immensely helpful in showing her work on Redfern and some images from the museum collection. And Carisbrooke Castle was the home of Princess Beatrice, the daughter of Queen Victoria. Okay, let's talk about Creed a little bit. Despite claims of a founding date of 1760, the earliest date of trading I've found is 1854, as a tailor of court, diplomatic, military, and naval uniforms, and that was as Creed and Cumberland. The following year, he married in Hampstead. In 1861, a son, Henry, was born at 33 Conduit Street. He clearly lived above the shop. By 1860, he was advertising it as a warrant holder for the Queen and princesses and for Eugenie, Empress of the French. This invoice, dated 1902, shows warrants for 12 royals. They are Queen Victoria, who's dead by then, but never mind, the Emperor and Empress of the French, the Prince Imperial, the Emperor of Russia, King and Queen of the Belgians, the Queen of Holland and the Prince of Orange, the Queen Regent of Spain, the Emperor and Empress of Austria. And Eugenie was one of his most important customers. She was a 26-year-old Spanish aristocrat when she married Napoleon III in January 1862, 2 months after he'd become Emperor of the French in a bloodless coup. The Second Empire was, to quote a phrase, going to make France great again. Trade expanded as industrialization and a large railway network brought goods and workers to Paris, which was remodeled by Baron Haussmann to the city we know today. Sorry, I'm getting so many messages on the screen. So this was his client. I can see that there's some, I need to go back to this to sort out these, how she could have married in 62 when in 60 Creed was claiming he was making clothes for her. I don't know, we'll go back to that. I will go back to that. And this was the defining image of her in the Second Empire, these frothy Worth dresses. Court life had essentially ceased with the accession of Louis Philippe, the citizen king. And in contrast, Eugenie, here surrounded by ladies in waiting, presided over an imperial court where men were expected to wear court dress, footmen wore powdered wigs, and the grand fête impériale with huge firework displays were held 4 times a year. Creed may well have seen the Second Empire offered opportunities. Savile Row, a crowded field, perhaps did not. The luxury trades boomed. Eugenie is credited with the rise of Worth and Louis Vuitton. And Worth, an English draper, had met the Empress in 1860. Sorry, she'd married in 52. My mistake. He and the Emperor persuaded her to wear heavy silk brocades, which she disliked, comparing them to curtain fabrics, to help promote the Republican-leaning Lyons silk industry. And as a result, she was called a fée chiffonnée, a chiffon fairy. This was very unfair because, in fact, she was a very sporty woman who didn't greatly like dressing up. Creed was working for the family before 1860, it was said, when she met Worth, so she already knew Creed. She was a keen horsewoman and she'd learned to ride astride in the Andalusian fashion. This popular lithograph by Jules David, who did a lot of fashion plays, she's described as an Amazon, this new breed of horsewomen, as it were. And the carte de visite shows a very typical Seville style of riding dress. As this landscape painting of Queen Victoria, the costume is mauve. It's described on things being mauve. It's her favourite colour. Worth sent her violets on her birthday, even after she'd abdicated to the UK. Or maybe because she's in mourning for her sister. So, and here you see this very severe style of side-saddle habit, which we get about this time, many made by Creed. And here's a Creed jacket in the Museum of London, now the London Museum. Their date of 1860 seems a little bit off because it says and sons. His first son wasn't born until the following year, but the label clearly shows the Paris address at 25 Rue de la Paix. And for the information I have present, he began trading there 4 years before Worth at number 7. Worth's always the first, you know. Right. The jacket of this little riding outfit looks to me, and it's very boned, you can see it has been altered by putting a fillet down the front, but the jacket looks very similar to me to this one worn by the Empress Eugenie. Curiously, purples, so this is more purples. I'm sorry, I'm getting more and more messages. I'm sorry. There's a
Marie,
recurrent thread in.
so if you can turn off the you can close the messages window if you want to, if it's distracting for you. There's a little X up in the corner.
I'm not finding it. I'll press on because I've overwritten as always. So I'll keep going and try and get used to. As we've seen with the silk ball gowns, she understood the power of clothes, the messages, unspoken messages. And this is perhaps a very important suit that Creed made for her. It's got a very similar high buttoned vest, as you can see. She wore this to open the Suez Canal. She was the only woman amongst several heads of state from Austria, Turkey, Egypt, and so on. And it's about power. She's power dressing as first power suit, if you like. She was there as a regent, not as a consort. She's important. She was the person in charge who was opening the Suez Canal. It was her finest hour, I would say. Within a year, the Second Empire was over, and she went into exile in England and lived there for the next 50 years. We don't know as much about as would be good because she took great pains to destroy all her archive on history. Just look at Redfern. Oh, sorry, this is to say that Creed carried on he kept his business after the fall of the empire. He stayed in Paris, he eventually closed his London office at the turn of the century, and here he is making clothes in the 1930s. With English newspapers saying the place you must go for your tailoring is Henry Creed, and Colonel Snow had said the same thing 20 years earlier. So Redfern, like Worth, he'd started as a draper. He opened his first business in Cowes around 1848 and supplied the royal residence at Osborne House with fabrics. You see, this is, for international people, this is a small island off the south coast of England with a very small population. And Cowes is a very, very small town. So he was very successful with this drapery business, which was a bit before Creed. And in 1846, Winterhalter, who'd been a popular court painter for Napoleon III, painted this picture of a 4-year-old Prince of Wales, and it started a fashion for dressing children in sailor suits. It's quite possible this is a sort of thing that Redfern was making in his early days in Cowes, which is a sailing centre in the UK. Princess Alexandra, the Princess of Wales, came to Osborne House for a honeymoon in 1863, and she ordered some clothes from Redfern. 10 years after, that was 10 years after Eugenie had become empress. But notice how much more feminine these clothes are than Creed's. I wouldn't call this tailoring at this point, really. So Redfern now had an illustrious client, and might be that were it not for the rising popularity of yachting for the rich and titled, that might have been the end of it. When I say the rich and titled in Cowes, tiny town, I really mean it. Here we go. So Here is Alexandra, now Queen, with her daughter, Princess Victoria. Up on the left is her husband, Edward VII, with his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm. On the right is her son, to be King George V, with his cousin, her sister's son, Tsar Alexander. Tsar Nicholas, obviously. Her sister was the Empress of Russia. Obviously, these men's clothes would have been made by their regular Savile Row tailors and military uniform makers, but their wives were a ready-made, rich clientele for Redfern. Until 1876, he traded solely in cows. He always styled himself as a ladies' tailor. He didn't open in Rue de Rivoli, just around the corner from Creed, until 1881. But his London address here, he opens in London, 1878, is 3 doors away from Creed, very, very close. The Americans' Cup brought many Americans to cows, and here's an American advertisement. He opened a branch in New York, run by his youngest son, Ernest Arthur, which expanded to include premises in resorts like Newport, Rhode Island, and Saratoga Springs. And there are far more, when you're looking for advertising places, there are far more American ones than English ones. I think this might just show that US academics are more zealous than us, I don't know. Like Creed, you can see he loved a royal warrant. And here we can see the warrants for the Princess of Wales, the Queen of Denmark, the Queen of England, the Queen of Portugal, and Alexandra's sister, the Empress of Russia. According to North, despite the many international branches, couture outfits were made in cows within a week. And this is the shop in Cowes. Oh, and here it is on fete, I would guess, for the Diamond Jubilee of 1897. And this is what it looked like when I visited Cowes a couple of years ago. The census return, this is, you talk about sweaty labour, this is extraordinary. The census return for 1891 shows 73 women living and working at 41 and 42 High Street Cowes. 53 of these were dressmakers, and tailors aren't mentioned at all. The Queen magazine, North says, had details for costumes made for the Princess of Wales for 4 costumes made for Princess of Wales between 1881 and 85, in addition to other cloaks and other tailor-mades. And presumably they were all made here in these very cramped surroundings. He was very happy to innovate. One of his innovations, which I think is a really good idea, was for a sailing outfit, was a skirt with a top made of jersey based on the sort of Fisher Gansey, which would have been very comfortable. I mean, this is comfortable sportswear. His tailored clothes have a softness we do not see in Creed, and they often feature braiding and asymmetric fastenings. He is famous for his bright silk linings, often glimpsed in a cuff or an overcoat, particularly in ulsters, apparently, where he had nice plaid silk linings. This is from a garment from Carisbrooke Museum next to Cape Tiley. And even this simplified label still got the crests on it, And this jacket from Carisbrooke demonstrates to me the difference between the structured Creed jacket riding jacket we looked at earlier, and what the French would call flou, this soft tailoring, and this lover passementiere. Look at the little pocket, just the one, I think it's rather. So in conclusion, say Busvine had bought out Redfern at some point between the wars. Creed was a man's tailor, working in Savile Row tradition with British woolen fabrics, and Britain excelled in both these things, the fabrics and the tailoring skills. He diversified into making women's wear with great success. And by the 20th century, women's tailoring was central to the idea of the British tailor-made. This is where I think is particularly important. Redfern, on the other hand, was a draper, making clothes using dressmakers. He did employ tailors, and he was well policed to use good wool and serge. The Isle of Wight had had fulling mills to beat wool into serge for centuries, so something like the 11th century. And he used, and often it became a feature of the house, he used Isle of Wight, what was called Isle of Wight serge. And he was not afraid to diversify. For example, the New York store sold furs, and used very clever marketing in women's magazines to promote the name of Redfern, a name with a worldwide reach, as we've seen. So it became a fashion label. I would say he was a massive fashion designer in the way of Armani or something. They both dressed two of the most powerful women in the world, and they made damn sure everyone knew with those crests in every label. You weren't going to be any doubt. And so by the time of this fashion plate, in Paris Vogue, note that English tailoring was seen as the best in the world, even in the fashion capital of Paris. So that's it. Thank you. Get out of here now, which is a...
If you just click the stop sharing button, if you can find it, if you move your mouse around, it should appear. And I'll hand over to Anna for some questions.
Hi, so some observations have come into the chat. Amazing garments, what a gorgeous carte de visite. Never knew Creed was so extraordinary. Beautiful labels. Hilary points out that the information makes a lovely counterpoint to all the stuff we know about Worth, and that this is, you know, this is really kind of timely to be doing this, Marie. It's a big process of kind of retrieval, isn't it? It's really interesting. There's a question from Hannah. If the royals made these tailors' names, which they clearly did, how do we know, do we know how they managed to get the royal connections to start with? And how do you get the warrant? Is it right place at the right time, or is that another story?
The answer is I don't know. I mean, obviously, with Redfern, it came after the Princess of Wales popping into his shop just down the road from the royal family's holiday home. You know, it's a fabulous Italian palace. If anyone's been there, just rather like Balmoral, and this was a draper's that supplied the, you know, thing. So that would obviously that's how she would have started there. Creed, on the other hand, he did have this reputation for riding dress. He was making riding dress clothes for 9 heads of state, he said. So he was making them for Napoleon III, probably before he restyled himself as Napoleon III when he was still president of France, whatever it was. So I think he met Eugenie through him. That's far as I know. What the mechanism for having a warrant was, I don't know. Probably less strict than today. And I also suspect there's a certain, what shall we say, laissez-faire attitude to using that. They weren't quite as concerned with the copyright perhaps as we've been.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Marie. Can I hand over to you, Hannah, for Mary's introduction?
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, on to our next speaker. So Mary Charlton is an independent researcher who has worked as a costume supervisor, maker and tailor for the museums and heritage industry, theatre, opera and fine. Will be co-written with Professor Lou Taylor and will be entitled Mapping the Making of Tailored Clothes for Women in London's East End, 1840 to 1900. And today she's presenting on Sewing Like an Engine, Women in the Tailoring Industry in London's East End, 1880 to 1891. So over to you, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you, Hannah. I'm going to try and share my screen. Okay, so after a tricky start, Lou suggested that I talk to you about our buttonhole case study, which is a small part of the chapter. So I'm going to try that. So on the 13th of July, 1888, Miss Rachel Gashan was called to the House of Lords to sew buttonholes for the Select Committee on the Sweater Trade Systems. Under the watchful eye of the committee clerk, She sewed 4 buttonholes for a coat, which were timed at 4 minutes the first, 3 1/4 the second, 3 1/4 the third, and 3 minutes the last, a total of 4 buttonholes in 13.5 minutes. 3 days later, a witness before the committee, Mr. Barnard Marcus, a tailor at 37 Conduit Street, was asked, "Do you think that a woman could keep up the rate of making 4 buttonholes in 13.5 minutes?" His response was, if she did, she would have to go like an engine. Our chapter started life as a paper presented at the 2021 conference, Women's Tailored Clothes Across Britain, Ireland, Europe and the Americas, 1750 to 1920, titled East End 1888, Booth and Webb, examining the development of tailoring by and for women in the East End of London, work in progress. A lockdown project, Lou and I examined 4 notebooks described as the Jewish notebooks, held in the Charles Booth archive at the London School of Economics. Jane Wilson worked on Beatrice Potter's diaries. 3 of the notebooks compiled between 1887 and 1888 specifically concerned the tailoring community in the East End, and we studied them in the hope of finding evidence of tailored garments being made by women and for garments being made for women in the East End. The notebooks form part of the basis of a vast empirical study conducted in 2 parts between 1886 and 1896, the first survey focusing on poverty, the second on industry. The results were published in 17 volumes and 3 editions between 1896 and 1906 as Life and Labour of the People of London. There had been a long-established Jewish community in the East End of London, but between 1880 and 1890, numbers increased dramatically due to the influx of Russian and Polish Jews fleeing from pogroms in the Pale of Settlement. The East End, already overcrowded with many people living in slum conditions below the poverty line of 16 shillings a week, became an area of huge social concern and prompted Booth's investigation into poverty. Many of the Jewish immigrants brought skills with them from the garment and tailoring trades, and in 1888, Booth instigated a special survey into tailors, led by his wife's cousin, Beatrice Potter, and George Arkell, one of Booth's secretaries. Independent to this, but in the same year, a parliamentary inquiry into the sweater trades was conducted by a House of Lords Select Committee, led by Lord Thring. The inquiry addressed such issues as poverty, living and working conditions, poor sanitation, the exploitation of unskilled labour, and the divisional system of work. And it looked at the boot and shoe, cabinet and upholstering and other trades, and tailoring. Booth's survey into tailors and the parliamentary inquiry ran concurrently, and many of the people interviewed in the Booth notebooks also appeared as witnesses before the Lords Committee. In both investigations, interviewees or witnesses called to give evidence included community and religious leaders, union leaders such as Lewis Lyons, clothing manufacturers and retailers and working tailors, including women who worked from home as finishers and buttonhole makers. Charles Booth and Beatrice Potter were also called to give evidence to this, so the 2 sources, Booth's notebooks and the minutes of the inquiry, combined to give a vivid and detailed overview of the tailoring trade in the East End at a precise point in time, 1888. The sources are quite overwhelming, with 334 pages in the 3 Booth notebooks relating to tailors, and the House of Lords report is 1,075 pages of dense text. But the information we extracted from the sources is wide-ranging, complex, and provides rich insights into many aspects of how the tailoring trade operated in light of this talk. However, what we did find, which this slide shows, is that whereas women in the West End tailoring trade were only employed as finishers and buttonhole makers, the majority of them working from home, in the overpopulated and unregulated East End, they took on a far greater range of roles across almost all of the trade, working as pressers, basters, machinists, finishers, and buttonhole makers. And what this slide also shows is that in all cases where women took on work that was also carried out by men, the women were always paid less. And the women who were paid least of all were the buttonhole makers. So the exchange between Lord Thring and Mr. Marcus stood out for us and prompted a case study of buttonholes and the women who made them. This is my original chart showing how many buttonholes were needed to earn 12, 16 and 20 shillings a week. And I've revisited the case study to look at buttonholes for different types of garments. This is still a work in progress as I find better ways of articulating and tabulating the information. The lists that we transcribed from the Booth notebooks found that there were 1,486 places where tailoring is done, 42 large factories or workshops, 25 hands and over, 265 medium workshops, 10 to 25 hands, 892 small workshops, 10 hands or less, and 198 domestic workshops employing only the family. Booth worked to a coding system and categorised the tailors by size of workshop and how many numbers were employed, and the class of work and the type of garment. The majority, 987, were making coats in general. Other garments described were trousers, vests and juveniles, with only 26 workshops making ladies' tailors' garments. I've used Booth's coding system to find examples and information in the sources for each type of garments he identified: coats, vests, trousers, juveniles and ladies. Where possible, I've been able to corroborate several different sources to arrive at a realistic figure of how much a woman could earn for making buttonholes for each type of garment she was working on. But what sort of buttonholes are we looking at? The type of garment might influence the number it was possible to make in an hour. A coat made from heavier material with canvas interlinings and larger buttons would almost certainly take longer than a vest, with lighter fabrics and smaller buttons. The holes for a bespoke jacket would likely take longer than a rough slop pair of trousers. An 1895 book, Practical Tailoring, published by the John Williamson Company, devotes 2 whole pages of written instruction for making a worked buttonhole, beginning with the cutting of the hole, adding the bar, then the process of stitching. According to the author, an ordinary well-sewn buttonhole of coat size has about 75 stitches in it. And the working of a good buttonhole must be a matter of long practice, and that every stitch must be made with exactly the same degree of tension or tightness, or the buttonhole will have an irregular appearance. And the stitch is not a simple one. Working over a gimp to reinforce the hole and help to give a strong edge, the thread must be looped around the point of the needle left to right, as illustrated in this diagram on the right, so that it forms a knot on the cut edge of the fabric. Buttons were provided, but the buttonhole hands, either in the workshops or in the home, had to provide their own thread and twist. One home worker refused to make twist buttonholes because the thread was so expensive. So Lewis Lyons, the tailoring union leader, described the detail of working a coat in a typical workshop. He told the lords that a buttonholer would be engaged in piecework and receive 1 halfpenny for every buttonhole worked, and would normally have 4 buttonholes in each garment. Each girl would work 40 garments in a day at a halfpenny a buttonhole. She would have to sew 15 buttonholes an hour at 4 minutes each in a working day, which would typically be 12 hours, with an hour and a half for dinner. The Factory Act restricted working hours for women to 10.5 hours in a large workshop, but Isaac Levy told the committee that the women working on buttonholes would be in the shop for 12 hours a day, but would then take their work home with them. Vests or waistcoats would typically have between 3 to 6 buttonholes. Even in the West End, they were traditionally given to women to make at home, and the same applied in the East End. The buttonholes were made at 2.5 to 3 pence per dozen, which equate to 1/5 or 1/4 of a penny per buttonhole. The Reverend Munro told the committee that in the large workshops, the buttonholer hands are usually paid 1.5 pence for 6 holes. A quick worker can make 18 holes in an hour, but 12 would be more usually done by the ordinary worker. A woman working 12 buttonholes an hour for 12 hours a day would make 144 buttonholes and be paid 3 shillings a day or 15 shillings a week. A woman making 18 buttonholes an hour for 12 hours a day would make 216 buttonholes and make 4 shillings 6 a day, or 22 shillings in a week. Mr. Myers employed 4 girls as buttonholers, to whom he paid 13 shillings for a 5-day week, working from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. He said that the girls would make full time and have regular work throughout the week for about 8 to 9 months, while the men's work paid by the day fluctuate more. Trousers appear to have been more typically finished by women working from home. Mrs. Killick supplied both Arkell and the Lords with a table of prices she was paid for each type of fabric. References I have found are for both finishing and buttonholes, so I haven't been able to separate the buttonholes out, although one source quotes 2d for 5 buttonholes. The work was hard. Mrs. Killick could only make 4 pairs a day at 4.5d, and said that she could only make 1 shilling 2d a day, out of which she had to pay 1.5d for twist for the 4 sets of 5 buttonholes, 20 buttonholes. Women working on juvenile garments were the lowest paid of all, especially if they were working from home. Arkell's report stated that it was the only branch of the trade which was predominantly run by women, although in a few Jewish shops men are employed and the management is often in the hands of men. There were 2 branches of juvenile work. The larger workshops would do everything on the premises, including the finishing and buttonholes. They employed a large number of young women who began as unpaid learners, and after a period of probation would be put onto 2 6 a week, rising 1 shilling to this. Group were women who were unable to work on the premises and had to take work home. Arkell was unable to find any consistency in the range of prices paid. One woman was paid 0.5d for making between 5 and 8 buttonholes on a juvenile jacket, or 10d per dozen for both felling and buttonholing. Barnet Marcus is atypical in that he had premises at Conduit Street in the heart of the West End, having worked as a sweater in the East End, but he is the only example I could find for ladies' garments. He claimed to pay the buttonhole hand 30 shillings a week, the same as the others, and that none of them earned below 16 shillings a week. He said they're supposed to come in at 8:30 and work until 8, but they never come in before 9:15. He said, I can never get more than 8 buttonholes an hour from any female. So in conclusion, although buttonholes were paid by the piece anywhere from 1/5 of a penny to 1 halfpenny per buttonhole, there is evidence of a huge variation in the amounts that could be earned, depending on where you were working, the type of workshop or domestic environment you worked in, the class of work, and the type of garment, and, since the buttonholes were paid piecework, how fast you could sew. Women working on the premises in the larger workshops could generally earn more per week than those working from home, but the hours were long and they would be there at least 12 hours a day. And even working on the premises, many women had to supply their own twist and thread. Women who worked from home and who were the worst paid always had to deduct the cost of thread from what they were paid by the piece. Women making buttonholes for the coat and ladies' trade appear to have been the best paid. Those making trousers and juveniles the lowest. So although there is clear evidence that some women could earn good wages for buttonhole work, albeit with very long hours, many more women were unable to achieve more than 10 shillings a week and were working way below the poverty line of 16 shillings a week, especially those women who were only able to work from home. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mary. If you stop sharing your screen, then
I'm trying to.
once again hand over to Anna for the questions. If you just move your mouse around, there should be something that says stop sharing somewhere.
Oh yeah, got it.
Cool.
Done.
Okay, so there are lots of comments in the chat about what a wonder these buttonholes are and how astonishing they were, and the sheer rate at which these highly skilled women workers were turning them out. But there's a really good question here. How do they learn to do it? were there classes, or was it watching and, you know, apprentice type thing, or how did these women get to be so proficient?
I don't think that there was such a thing as an apprenticeship scheme, particularly not in the East End. So I think it was absolutely done by learning from a peer. And there are all sorts of comments about there are all sorts of comments that I have found in the descriptions saying that for buttonholes, all that a girl needed to do was to be able to use a needle. So that I think it's fairly obvious that she was just taught on the job, and I think that's probably why the buttonhole workers in the juvenile factories sort of would start free for 3 months, and then very, very gradually build up their wages.
Wow. And I mean, how standardized were the actual finished buttonholes? Can you tell different makers' hands from looking at garments, or are they really machine-like?
It's very difficult to tell because I think that the surviving garments are of a better class. So there's a consistency among those. That there's not very many examples of the slop work, which I think is, you know, the stuff that would have been churned out. I still find it extraordinary that Rachel Gashian could make 18 buttonholes an hour. Because I've tried. I'm not going to tell you how I got on.
Brilliant. Any more questions for Mary before we move on? Anybody else? One coming from Hannah. If men undertook buttonholes work, were they paid more, or were they simply not given the buttonhole work?
Well, they were simply not given the buttonhole work. It's as simple as that. One of the people who was interviewed by the House of Lords, I think it was either Mr. Myers or Mr. Moses, was saying that he could only do 6 buttonholes an hour. So the women were given the work because they could do 8, 10, or 12 buttonholes an hour.
Right.
And also they would have been paid more. But it just didn't happen. And I think it's sort of fairly standard. It was fairly standard in the tailoring industry, West End and East End, for years and years and years, that the women would do the finishing. So felling in of linings and sleeve linings and the buttonholes, sewing on the buttons, while men got on with the serious stuff.
Wow. That's so interesting. What a fantastic paper. Thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you.
That was brilliant.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Hannah. Dr. Hannah Rumblecroft, an experienced lecturer specialising in 19th and early 20th century dress, women's tailoring, Quakerism, material culture, and women's studies. Her chapter will be entitled "The Masculinity of the Modern Woman is Good for Trade." And today she's presenting on, and this is such a great title, she could see him put his arms around his female customers to take their measure and maintain her self-control. Whew. Tact, timidity, and touch in women's tailoring.
Okay, I'm going to start, but I'm aware that my connection's a bit flaky. So if I start to break up, shout, and I'll turn off my camera, and that might fix it. Okay. So this paper forms one small part of a chapter in Tailoring for Women 1800 to 1930 that will consider how and why the tailoring trade has been historically associated as masculine, and how this has obscured the place and commonality of tailors accommodating female clients in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It will chart the presence of the tailoring for women in the British trade, while illustrating the conflicting attitudes towards the female tailoring customer. In doing so, it indicates the common presence of tailors' female customers and the accommodation of their bodies by the British tailoring trade. Yet it also illustrates how their presence was not without prejudice, how their drafting systems remained subordinate to men's, prioritising the male customer and menswear, how many British tailors were not trained as standard in the production of women's tailoring, and how many tailors were scornful at the notion of producing tailored garments for women at all, and how the act of touching a female customer for measuring was so socially thorny that some male tailors resisted the integration of the female body into their craft, thus preserving its masculinity. It's this one element of measuring and touch which my presentation today will focus on. The measuring of the body upon which the tailored garment rests was and always has been of the utmost importance to the tailor. Careful measuring helped achieve the close, structured fit which was designed to mould the garment to an ideal and accommodate the active pursuits they were intended for. Even prior to the production of graded pattern systems, the master tailor knew of the great necessity of being particular in measuring, and tailored women's wear was no exception. In his tailoring manual of 1835, G. Walker impresses on his reader the care with which the tailor should take measurements of the female customer, explaining that the appropriate manner in which to measure a woman would claim the priority of the book's attention. Directions outlined in tailoring manuals indicate that a distinct gender-specific skill set was required to be learnt by the tailor for measuring women customers, let alone cutting their garments. In the production of women's tailored jackets, coats, and bodices, the measuring of the breast was crucial to a close but comfortable fit. Walker recommended, with little ceremony, that the tailor take the size around the chest, which must be taken round close under the arms and over the most prominent part of the breasts. Similarly, Hadfield recommended, place the end of the measure even with the top of the back seam and continue it to the centre of the breast. Peel was even more detailed when he suggested that to measure for a habit or pelisse, the tailor should take the length from the top of the back to the nipple of the breast and to the bottom under the breast. Lawson's Fitting Made Easy also emphasized careful measuring of the breast, noting, in taking the breast measure, see that the tape goes well over the shoulder blades and comes down over the most prominent part of the bosom. From a contemporary perspective, it's the intimate proximity with which the male tailor must touch their female customer by moving their hands and tape measure over the woman's form, which is perhaps the most notable of the requirements raised in these directions. However, it's striking to hear the objectivity of the tone of these instructions with no acknowledgement or direction as to appropriate administration of this intimacy. In part, this may be explained by the impartiality and pragmatism with which the tailor must carry out his trade. Many tailors could hardly afford to be squeamish about plying their trade with women when financial stability and arguably the honing of their craft demanded it. It may also be indicative of broader 19th century attitudes which perceived that the body and senses should be governed by reason, and thus experiencing any sense of an interpersonal relationship or sexual tension in the act of touch was undesirable and base. Classen has described how we can find this attitude already in the historical writing of the 19th century, when the notion that high culture requires the suppression of the lower senses was formalized. Touch was typed by the scholars of the day as a crude and uncivilized mode of perception. Simply by its absence in the systems and manuals, there is certainly an indication that the male tailoring trade during the early 19th century suppressed any published discussion surrounding the intimacy of the act of measuring women customers. Despite this, the act of touching a female customer for measuring was socially thorny. Indeed, it's a point of academic agreement that touch between two living bodies is never inert. Maclaren, in Touching Matters, Embodiment of Intimacy, has described how touch is a melody that forms itself successfully into a medium of resonance between two people, or falls into screeching dissonance and alienates them from each other. The hand of the tailor was not a passive one, but instead was a hand used to explore and reveal the female customer's form, its boundaries and undulations. The tailor's social protocols were therefore tactics designed to navigate his touch towards a resonance rather than a dissonance with the client. For Maclaren, the body passively being touched initiates an incorporation of new areas of our bodies, while also inviting us to play around our bodily boundaries and to feel our bodily limits and the body's own intentionality. Through this experience, the female customer would have been made highly cognizant of their own body, its form and margins, as the male tailor's touch enlivened parts of the body with sartorial and tangible meaning. Thus, while the act of a male tailor measuring a female customer was a pragmatic necessity to the job, it was also haptically and socially complex. As Christopher Breward admits in The Suit, the crucial ritual of measuring was intensely personal in nature. Even in the masculine domain of the tailor's shop, it was understood that when touch was absolutely necessary between the male tailor and a male customer, it must be performed properly according to its socially dictated etiquette. For example, the tailor T.H. Holding in 1880 described how all measuring on a sensitive, intelligent man should be undertaken on the male client's right side or from behind, never in front, and described how a tailor operating outside of these protocols could be perceived as gross and offensive. Kent has described measuring as one of the most delicate moments in the balance of power between tailor and gentleman. Measuring for women for tailored clothing was thus more delicate still. Tailoring directives advocating close measuring of the female anatomy were in striking opposition to the extreme prudishness with which wider 19th century society regarded even the most basic of interactions between the opposite sexes. Etiquette manuals often contained precise guidance on touch within a socio-cultural framework of wider 19th century society, and frequently noted how even the most contemporarily innocuous types of touch between the sexes could be perceived as improper. For example, the Lady's Guide to Perfect Gentility noted how to seize any person by the waist or arm or to touch their person are in the highest degree displeasing. In 19th century society, a woman's reproductive function defined her character, position, and value, mandating the largely male medical profession's superintendence of the female body, and thus necessary touching of women, while simultaneously justifying the social prohibition of other male touch. The female customer of the tailor would therefore have felt the touch of a man on her body in a manner which in nearly all other environments and circumstances, other than marriage, medical, and close familial relationships, was highly guarded against. Thus, the actions of the tailor, however scientific the framing of the endeavour, would have been weighted with trepidation for their possibility of impropriety, misinterpretation, or simply a social blunder by either party. Indeed, a poem from as early as 1687 points out the incredible contradiction between societal prudishness and the undertaking of the tailor's craft, and may also have recognised the prospect of indecorum in the act of a male tailor measuring a female customer, in saying, "Behold the merchant tailor Annin's hand, a measure whilst the lady fair does stand, patient without a blush, and lets him do what brave gallants dare not pretend unto. When others pine but for a glance or kiss, by him the coyest beauty handled is." When Stanley's poem tells us that even in the earliest centuries of male tailors accommodating female customers, social commentators, and in this case poets, were aware of the possibility of impropriety, misinterpretation, or inappropriateness when male tailors touched female customers for measuring, even to the extent of caricature. Another account in the Tailor and Cutter 200 years later comedically summarized a divorce case of a tailor forced to leave his wife due to her extreme jealousy of his dealings with his female customers. According to the report, "She has ruined his business by her extreme jealousy. She could not see him put his arms around his female customers to take their measure and maintain her self-control." In both instances, it is the hands of the male tailor on the female customer when measuring that is singled out for censure. Bawdy poetry and humorous news stories satirizing the role touch played in the relationship between male tailor and female customer may have been a popular mechanism for communicating these moral agitations, but they by no means dispelled or dissipated the genuine moral concerns around the practice. The advent of tailored riding breeches for women in the final decades of the 19th century appears to have necessitated a frantic pursuit of explicit guidance for male tailors, timorous at acquiring female customers' inner leg measures. This guidance revealed, firstly, the increasingly common use of female fitters from the 1870s, employed for taking women's measurements, but also secondly, the decades-long evasions some tailors had been taking. An 1886 article entitled New Invention for Lady Equestrians, praising the design of a pair of riding breeches for ladies designed by Touts & Co., is revelatory for indirectly revealing two forms of evasion to touch which tailors undertook when gathering women clients' measurements. Firstly, the aptly named system of measurement required the female customer to measure themselves or to have their lady's maid take the measurements. This was done either in a discreet room of the tailor's shop or at home via a code of printed instructions. While self-measuring became increasingly commonplace for tailored garments for all sexes throughout the 19th century, as ready-made, made-to-measure and catalogue purchases became increasingly commonplace, this approach is decried by the writer, who states that when ladies take their own measurements or get their maids to take them, the result is unsatisfactory, if not altogether wrong. Untrained female customers or their maids were clearly being asked to take their own intimate measurements for tailored clothing, in some cases to avoid the male touch. Secondly, the article goes on to castigate the equally unsatisfactory practice of a naturally timid shopman taking a few hurried jottings from measurements taken hastily on the outside of a lady's skirt. Suggested here is a timorousness of many male tailors to touching women customers, leading them to measure the already worn garment rather than tightening the tape adequately to take measurements of the woman's physical form. Indeed, commentary on this timidity became somewhat of a theme during this time throughout the tailor and cutter. The article Knickers and Breeches Cutting, written on the measurements for ladies' riding trousers and breeches, observed in the measuring of female customers that some cutters are very awkward in the performance of many of these and such like professional duties. It goes on to essentially encourage male tailoring readers to pull themselves together, saying that everyone not naturally endowed with lightness of touch and lightning rapidity of action should, as far as possible, discard their diffidence and train themselves in tact and expertness. As to timidity on the cutter's part, that is most ridiculous. Clearly, the writer, Leighton, understood that timidity of touch did not lead to good tailoring. However, he also grasped, later in the article, that during the 19th century, the socio-cultural squeamishness of the sexes touching was so acute that means of circumventing this obstacle, a hindrance, was required. In doing so, he advocated a gender-specific approach to measuring female customers for breeches in a manner which accommodated the male measurer's reticence, advising, first, cause the lady to sit down on a chair sufficiently low so that her knees and bodies are at right angles with each other. When seated, measure from the hollow above the hip bone to the seat of the chair. This gives the rise or body depth required. Next, ask the lady to stand up and take the length from the hollow above the hip bone to the length required below the ankle. The difference between these two measures gives the inner leg length. Such an approach is striking in its simplicity. Here, a prop, a chair, is utilized as a corresponding geometric fixed point, a safe, stable position which the tailor could robustly touch without fear of impropriety. Here, the chair seat proxies the body, its inert solid structure a safe harbor for the tape and hand. Leighton's breeches method provides a crystalline example alongside a list of 5 others, which appear across this example alone, of a female-specific measuring approach being adopted by male tailors for one key purpose: to avoid touching the female client's body, especially not the highly intimate inner leg area. The existence of such approaches, where few such allusions exist for male-tailored clothing counterparts, emphasizes just how acute and therefore relevant the fear of touch was to male tailors with female customers. It's little wonder, therefore, that throughout the 19th century, male tailors resisted the integration of the female body into their craft, thus preserving its masculinity. Despite the best efforts of the objective tailoring manuals, as a matter of reality, social disquietude around the handling of the female body permeated the trade in all its forms. For many tailors, as the measuring of the female body by men was considered by men was considered intimate, thus socially awkward and even embarrassing. Even the presence of women customers in the tailoring space could be rendered thus by association. This social disquietude was such that it may have played into the idea that tailors, and even their corresponding shops, were better suited as strictly masculine domains. Thank you.
Wow, what an incredible paper, Hannah.
Thank you.
Blimey. I mean, there's a lot.
There's a lot to unpack, isn't there? And my frustration is I've written so much on this now. This is just like a sliver.
Oh,
So,
what
yeah.
an exciting sliver, though. You've really lifted up a little corner here, haven't you? And there's a lot of people very excited about a lot of this.
Oh, good.
I mean, the chat falls into different areas. So we start off with thinking very hard about breasts.
Yeah.
And
I've been thinking hard about breasts as well. So tricky.
So I've always had this thing in historical dressing, the position of the breasts. Sometimes you see them bound, sometimes you see them crazy high, sometimes
Yeah.
sticking right out, sometimes hanging low. And these standardized measurements, so you measure from the most prominent part. How was that decided? Was there any conversation with corsetry at the time? How did the tailors
That's a really
work it all
interesting
out?
point, actually, because what's interesting is the reason why I've ended up turning to the inner leg measure discussion is because that came at a much later point in the century. I think where written commentary on this stuff was much more prevalent, and therefore you get explicit commentary. Whereas explicit, as I've said, explicit guidance on the intimacy of this stuff is just not written. So when these systems first come out in the kind of 1820s and 1830s, and they're being published and disseminated, and people are starting to use them, the guidance is there, but there's no that I found so far. I can't find discussion around how you make these decisions around where do you put your hands, or how do I go about doing this, essentially. There's almost nothing. So from a contemporary perspective, the breast measurement seems like a huge intimacy, or feels like it must have felt like a huge intimacy, but I can't find any guidance as to how that intimacy would have been administered. The guidance that I'm finding is falling much later in the century, and that's kind of exploding around this idea that you need an inner leg
I'm sure you
measure.
will. You'll keep digging and you'll unearth it.
Yeah. So I'm keeping on digging. Don't worry, I'll find it.
So then the chat moves on to much more about crotches.
Mm,
The whole issue of how do you measure down there. There's a
mm,
bit of chat about whether similar ideas of timidity and delicacy also focus on the male tailor and the male customer.
yeah.
And then there's a long chat between the costume makers here today and
Great.
just what sort of tape measure you use and where you put it and
Great. I'll have a
whether you
look at
get
it.
other people to do their measuring and then report back. And then there are
Yeah.
problems with inaccuracy, which you also pick up on.
Yeah.
So it's a lot. I mean, there's so much stuff
Right.
here. And you're
It's
going to
really
have
interesting because one of the things that's been really useful for this is obviously there's a lot written about the male tailoring counterpart, and obviously the trouser making, it has an equivalence. So that's really interesting. So what I've been able to do is go and have a look at the advice that's given to male tailors about male trouser measuring. And that is what's interesting is that is much more an acknowledgement that that inner leg measure will need to be taken. It's about how you go about taking it on a man delicately. And a lot of it is about discussions around how you get them to help you so that you don't have to navigate which side they dress themselves. Yeah. So essentially, there's tape measures that they encourage, like that some of the manuals encourage the tailors to use, which basically have a hook. So you give the hook to your customer and ask him to place it in his crotch at the highest point. And then that means that obviously, as a tailor, you can take that inner leg measure on a male customer without having to, put your finger there. So really interesting. But for women, there's just no, just absolutely no.
Interesting.
Mm.
And probably time for one last question. Mackenzie asks, what about corset making? Because stay makers were male until 19th
Yeah.
century. Were they
Yeah,
not?
it's a really good question. It's a really, you know what? I hadn't even considered that I could go to those sources and see what they advised and see if that would correspond over, or if I could correspond that over. So
This
thank
is
you.
a rich vein.
Yeah, it really is. That's
Very
brilliant.
much.
Yeah. I'll go and have a look at that stuff around corset making and see how they're navigating that. Because yeah, that's really useful. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Do you want me to introduce the next speaker?
Yeah, sure. Why not? That'd be great. Thanks.
Let's see if I can find it. She says, okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Sarah Johnson, who has evolved from designing costumes for theatre and entertainment venues to the academic study of textile and dress history, the study and teaching of material culture and design history. Today she'll be presenting on her chapter entitled The Development of Women's Ready-Made Tailored Clothing in New York's Pre-Department Store Dry Goods Firms, 1840 to 1870.
Thank you, Anna. All right, here we go. Pray hope. All right, thanks very much. I have my work will intersect all of a number of these issues that Marie has raised and that Hannah has raised and that Mary has raised. And we're just gonna take a look at briefly a few things that are going on in New York City. Again, briefly, New York is not the only place where ready-made women's tailored garments are happening. It's also going on in other cities like port cities like New Orleans and San Francisco, as Western expansion continues on. But for the purposes of this study, we're really going to focus on New York because of the immigration issue. And one of my first jobs out of college was at the Ellis Island Immigration Museum in the curatorial department. So immigration history has always been at kind of top of mind for me. This is an illustration of Lower Broadway again, this one from the 1850s, where all of this activity is taking place. And previous historians have cast 19th century American ready-made clothing as a cheap alternative for sailors and the enslaved. Again, expanding then to cheaper men's suits, but have largely excluded women's tailored garments and their participation from this new industry. This presentation re-examines this debate, largely because of things that I have found doing the research in the Corso group and papers I have presented for our conferences. And that this really requires some re-examination through the lens of period commentators, including some of the business journalists. Edwin T. Friedley, Freeman Hunt from Hunt's Merchants magazine, which a lot of people in this group probably know, and a lesser known character called Thomas Prentice Kettle, all of whom witnessed this revolution, as it was called, that Friedley described in his 1858 book, Philadelphia and its Manufacturers. These authors clarified that dry goods dealers began manufacturing ready-good garments in response to tariffs on imports. And I'll keep going. But so basically today, we're just going to look at a couple of things briefly. Immigrants, many of these merchants, A.T. Stewart, the Hearn brothers, Aaron Arnold was actually from the Isle of Wight, and the Hearn brothers were as well. Aaron Arnold marries a Hearn. So there's a lot of intermixing as these again, English and Scot and Irish men emigrate to the States. And there's also another, again, to continue this issue of who's touching women's bodies. I think we have to take that back to the tailor's wife from earlier periods of time. And then that evolves in this period of time to what was called the tailoress, and then to women, saleswomen, and then ultimately to the man-tailored suits we know that are being marketed in the States by at least 1880. So the growth of ready-made clothing certainly includes women's tailored garments, and probably as early as the 1830s. The difficulty is that in the advertising is not very sophisticated, though it will grow that way as the course of the 19th century evolves. In the 1830s, this is a trade card from from A.T. Stewart's shop. Again, doesn't give us much intel at all, except that they were importers and jobbers of goods. And then the back of this envelope from the 1850s, where Lord and Taylor is right in the beginning, just up from the flap. So that we don't get a lot of specific information from the advertising intel, and that's what has driven me to look at other sources, government documents, and now specifically these business writers from this period of time. Again, part of what really changes the game is the tariff that's passed in 1828 that really significantly imposes very expensive tariffs on textiles. And then so merchants, being as they were, would import ready-made clothing at a broader level, market level than has previously been discussed. And then it seems they were importing textiles under the guise of ready-made clothing, garments that had been cut. So that then the call for increasing tariffs on ready-made clothing, as well as we see here, also gets put into play. So there's a much broader economic discourse that's going on in this country, and that becomes really important if you keep in mind that A.T. Stewart, at one point, all of the merchandise that was coming through the port of New York, variously, sometimes it was a sixth of it to a tenth of all of those goods were coming to A.T. Stewart. So it was an enormous industry as these industries are growing, and these immigrants are, again, going back and forth and importing goods until the tariffs really make that much, much more expensive, which is when I think we can probably look at why these industries, these national industries get growing, to avoid those tariffs. And the contemporary situation notwithstanding, it's interesting how the tariffs keep reappearing. Another thing that surprised me is again the Great Fire in 1835. I think radically changes the dry goods industry because the entire district is burned up along Pearl Street and over to the river on the east side. In this Frederick Conant ad, he says, any persons having ready-made clothing in their possession saved from the late fire that does not belong to them will confer favor by sending information to where he has moved his offices in 178 Pearl Street upstairs. But he also is calling for tailors and tailoresses to reemploy them as they're rebuilding after the fire. And I think that as well as the financial panic that happens in 1837 really radically changes how dry goods dealers are dealing. And I believe that's particularly after that panic, they're really looking for ways to broaden their income streams. And I think ready-made clothing becomes one of those streams. One of the labor historians that I love, a guy called George Kirstein, who was the son of a garment manufacturer himself, wrote a book called Stores and Unions in the middle of the 20th century. And he was the one who, or his work tipped me off to the idea that Aaron Arnold goes to Paris in the early 1850s, 1851 to 53, sees women's ready-made garment departments in Parisian stores and brings that idea back and sets it up. But I think actually that might have been going on earlier because of these advertisements. And this one from the Christmas season in 1848 that specifies cloaks of our own manufacture. So they're basically embracing that idea of the wholesale market. And they're in a position to do it because they have all of the textile dealers good deals on textiles that they're getting. They know what's selling, and they can certainly hire the workers to do that particular job. So then just in terms of how to look at this, I took that phrase, cloaks of our own manufacture, to newspapers.com and ran it through there. And on the little graph on the right, we see that doesn't pop up until 1848, and then spikes in 1849, just for the 40s. So there's clearly earlier stuff going on here that my chapter has a look at. Again, ready-made clothing is made up on site as an aspect of wholesaling. A.T. Stewart builds the Marble Palace in 1846, and it has specific spaces, interior spaces devoted to making up goods on site, as does when he moves uptown in 1863 to the Cast Iron Palace at Broadway and 9th Street. It also has on-site manufacturing facilities. And there's a really famous, that workroom that was in Frank Leslie's Illustrated Weekly from 1874, but a bit later than what we're talking about right now. They don't seem to illustrate the making up much in this period of time. Dry goods merchants had the capital to pay for the labor, make up the clothing, and it was especially women. All of these business writers talk about women and immigrants doing this much more cheaply. Again, they had fabrics, and then when the sewing machine technologies get sorted out, they have the money to invest in those. One of the cloak makers in this period of time, the ready-made cloak maker, is Molly Newbell. This is one of his cloaks from 1854, as made by and sold by the Boutier brothers in a Philadelphia store. I think what's interesting is that, again, the ready-made cloaks are still playing with adapting European styles for the American tastes, and this is La Belle Parisienne. So then this is an interior again of the dry goods store from the 1830s. Before they're taking on this, or before they're selling things, when they're just selling textiles. However, again, as Friedli says, ready-made clothing within the last quarter century, and that book came out in 1856, or the book that this quote is from. He calls it a complete revolution has been effected of tailoring, as well as a branch of the dry goods trade, by the introduction of ready-made clothing, especially ladies' clothing. Even though evidence is harder to find, it's still out there. And I think it's important that we bring these women back into the margin, back from the margins into the center of this discourse. So in terms of gender and labor issues, we move from the tailor's wife to the tailoress, women in-store manufacturing, and earning significantly cheaper wages than men. As we know, industrialization makes that true. A lesser known article that was in Hunt's Merchants magazine called Salesmen versus Saleswomen, that was published in August 1850, talks about how men working as clerks it was really a waste of their masculine energy. And I think that it's an early example of kind of anti-LGBTQ language, because they're referred to as dapper dandies, man milliners, and he biddies. And again, dapper dandies and man milliners are really, really made fun of in a lot of the fiction written by women in this period of time. There's also, we talked about George Kirstein, there's also a number of tailoress strikes, again, as these industries are evolving and labor, and particularly German, more sort of extreme socialistic German laborers come and begin to mix up that discourse. So the tailoress strikes will continue through the 1840s and 50s, again, until we come out on the other side to women being, again, excluded from this industry by the man-tailored suit in the 1880s. And here's just a look, a daguerreotype of Pearl Street and Chatham Street. It's Chatham Street is Park Row now, which is downtown, kind of by City Hall and City Hall Park. again, not far from where A.T. Stewart had his shop. And another one of these, I don't know this, I haven't been able to find this Solomon. I don't know if it's the spelling of the name. I'm not exactly sure. But again, this trade card, large assortment of clothing ready-made in a superior style, constantly on hand. They have this dated as 1860s, but I wonder if it in fact is not earlier. And then immigration history, as it was written in 1949, very well by studies by this historian called Robert Ernst, who goes ward by ward. And he has a whole section about the ready-made clothing industry. Again, he says that in 1840, the majority of the city's ready-made clothing workers were English, Scotch, and American. That then the Irish famine of the 40s left the Irish the most numerous group by the mid-century, and in the custom trade, it's the English and Irish that advanced to become more senior managers. At the same time, work formerly performed by American and Irish women was taken over by German families, so we're back to the tailor's wife there. Women, again, earning half as much as men. So all of these new-ish evidence, it just, it just seemed as if a re-examination of women's ready-made clothing is appropriate, given how much more access we have to material with digital databases. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Anna, you good to do the questions?
Wow, yeah, there's generated a lot of interest. So, wow.
Yeah, I know, he biddy, right? Oh my God.
Sorry, I'll correct myself. Okay, here we go. So this is a story of putting goods out for sale to very particular communities within a developing city. And there's a bit of wondering about who these immigrant communities were. Are we talking about Irish, Italian, French? What's the story here? Who are they catering to? Or is it many different stores catering to different communities?
I think it's many different stores catering to different communities. And again, the deeper that I go, the more that I'm finding there was a series of kind of city directories come almanacs called New York as It Is that were published in the 1830s and 40s. And in the 1840 edition of that, the Panic of 1837, that again wipes out a lot of dry goods retailers because they bought high and then the market drops out the bottom and they can't pay their bills, their annual bills. But by 1840, the reformers, helping people out of the poverty of that panic, were offering ready-made clothing, and ready-made clothing was being taught in the prisons, and which was completely surprising to me. Now, whether or not it was new ready-made clothing is another issue. But I think that sort of social reform arm of it is something that I'm not sure has been looked at before, because I don't know that literature at all. But I think it's really interesting that they were teaching those skills and also schools for the deaf and the dumb. I hate that word, but the period word. Yeah. So
yeah, using the terminology of the time period, obviously. There seems to be quite a crossover here with what was happening in London's East End, and Hannah's asking about whether the brands of ready-mades intersect at all with the same makers who supplied Hireman Company in East End of London. Have you?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a really great question, Hannah. Let's keep talking about that. I don't have that answer off the cuff, but let's keep thinking about that and talking about that, because I think that's a really interesting. I'm not sure that things were branded in this period of time as we think of them as being now, especially at this level. But again, it's maybe that I just haven't found that intel yet too, so I'm not sure.
Interesting. Gail would like to know how sizing was approached. Manufacturing is obviously growing. Is there standardization, or is there a sense that this is coming?
I don't have much information about that. The the material that I have looked at so far doesn't really talk about that aspect of it. But I think it's a really interesting thing to look at. The other point that surprised me, I have to say, is how much, again, given the steam age, how much is being imported to the States from Europe. That's ready-made clothing, because I think that, you know, the thought is that it's the bottom of the barrel, right? It's crappy stuff for miners and sailors, but it's not.
Not at
There's a
all.
much broader market there. So that I think that there's, you know, that exists by probably the 1820s. If the 1828 tariffs are any indication, and that I think becomes, you know, continues to be an issue throughout the course of the evolution of this period. So, yeah, I
Sure.
think that second quarter of the 19th century is really key in the development of this.
Now, you start a really interesting discussion off with your use of the extraordinary and appalling phrase, he biddies. Whoa. So, man milliner, Hilary comes in with, this was a phrase that's used right back in the 1790s. I mean, this would imply that there is some discussion about what we would know as LGBT within the apparel industry, and there is some critique of a man by his association with female being thought of in a different way. I mean, this is really interesting, isn't it? How are you going to write that one up?
I know, right? Yeah, it's fascinating. And again, as I have dipped into that, I think that that's really when women are, you know, there's a surge of women in terms of clerking in these stores, because, you know, the women are taking the place of these men. And in addition to that, then I'm doing the measuring and the cutting and the fitting, or the fitting, you know, and the assisting with trying clothes on and that sort of thing, for other women. Again, bearing in mind, American department stores still had segregated lunchrooms in the 1890s. So you couldn't sit next to a man and eat your sandwich, or whatever. You know, so that the idea that a man is measuring a woman's body, I'm not going to say that it never happened, but there's some, again, that's where I think the tailoresses or the assistants, there were female assistants who were doing that work, and that they have been thought of less because so much of these histories have been written by men.
Right. And on the question of segregation, are there issues of race that also play a part in this narrative?
Well, yeah, in terms of the American department store and dry goods landscape, they were pretty segregated to white workers. Generally speaking, and this extends well into the 20th century. If you were African American and you wanted to work in a department store, you had to start as in the cleaning crew, and a number of people worked their way up from that. In the 1930s, 40s, 50s. But again, that would also be very geographically specific about where they were. And the Quaker influence, I think, is an interesting one there too, because Philadelphia, there's a fair amount of manufacturing that's going on in Philadelphia, and the Quaker influence in those stores seems to have been more open to women working in these stores. So.
Okay, I think we're probably going to have to stop there, aren't we, Hannah? There's plenty more.
Unfortunately, yeah.